Chapter 4. Time became a slow, agonizing wait. In my old life, a week was nothing but a blink. It was a momentary pause spent sitting on a velvet throne, plotting a coup or watching a city burn. Time was a resource I had an infinite supply of. Now, every single hour was a physical burden I had to drag across the finish line. Days bled into one another in a miserable, blurred routine of survival. I was forced to experience the terrifying, biological horror of human healing. My skin didn't simply knit itself back together flawlessly overnight like it used to. Instead, it was a disgusting process. My scrapes turned into dry, violently itchy patches that flaked away against the cheap cotton of my oversized t-shirt. The deep, heavy bruises on my ribs shifted colors like rotting fruit, going from a dark, angry purple to a sickly yellow. Every time I inhaled too deeply, the fractured bone underneath screamed in protest, being a constant reminder of how incredibly fragile this shell really was. I quickly realized my new body demanded constant, exhausting maintenance. I had to eat. It wasn't the clean, elegant thirst for life I was used to. It was a mechanical requirement. I had to force mundane, heavy food down my throat just to stop my hands from shaking and my head from spinning. Stale white bread, lukewarm canned tomato soup, tap water that tasted faintly of metal and chlorine. I could actually feel the food sitting in my stomach, feeling my body break it down, a sluggish, heavy process that made me want to claw my own skin off. I slept for 10, sometimes 12 hours a night, only to wake up feeling like I had been crushed under a collapsed building. The exhaustion was buried deep in my bones. As this routine became the depressing metronome of the apartment, she woke up at 6 in the morning, moving through the cramped space with heavy, dragged steps. She left early for school every day and returned in the late afternoon looking completely hollowed out, as if something invisible was slowly drawing the life out of her. The silent, suffocating dread she carried was always in the room with us, hanging in the air like smoke. Her phone buzzed constantly. It was a relentless, rapid wall of digital notification that vibrated against the cheap surface of her desk or the wooden nightstand. It sounded like a swarm of angry insects trying to break through the glass screen. She rarely answered it. She would just stare at the glowing device. Her face would go tight, her jaw would clench so hard I could see the muscles jumping under her pale skin. But beneath the exhaustion, I could see a dark, quiet anger beginning to brew. She was sick of being prey. Instead of crying, she would shove the phone deep into her backpack with a furious, jerky motion, absolutely refusing to give them the satisfaction of a response. She was being hunted too, not by department mages or island assassins, but by her own kind. The fragile, vicious little humans in her school. We never talked about it. We barely spoke at all. There was no grand friendship between us, no emotional confessions in the dark. We were just two trapped animals hiding in a concrete box, orbiting each other in the cramped space, careful not to collide and careful not to ask the questions that would break our fragile peace. On the fourth day, a heavy rain washed over the city. Asti grabbed her backpack, pulled up the hood of her dark jacket, and walked to the front door without saying a word. The heavy metallic click of the deadbolt echoed in the narrow hallway. She locked it from the outside. The silence of the empty apartment immediately pressed in on me, absolute and suffocating. The only sound was the rain lashing against the window panes. I pushed myself off the squeaky spring mattress. My knees popped, and my back ached in a way that made me feel incredibly old. I walked slowly to the bathroom, flipping on the fluorescent light that flickered to life with a dull hum. Bracing my hands against the edges of the porcelain sink. I stared into the cracked mirror. I looked pathetic. The dark circles under my eyes made my face look like a skull draped in pale, translucent skin. I bared my teeth at the glass, trying to command my fangs to drop, trying to summon the lethal weapons that used to slide effortlessly from my gums. Nothing happened. I just stared at blunt, flat, useless human animal. Disgusted, I splashed freezing water onto my face, shivering as the cold bit into my skin, and turned off the light. I walked into the living room and looked through the plastic blinds. The city was a grey grid stretching out for kilometers. Towering Soviet blocks disappeared into the low-hanging fog, and the wet asphalt below looked like a black river. As I stared at the grim landscape, a wave of pure, unfiltered paranoia hit me. A locked wooden door wouldn't stop them. It wouldn't stop the department mages, and it wouldn't stop island hunters. I hadn't just entered this world through a polite doorway. My violent, unauthorized dimensional tear had left a scar, a residual static in the local atmosphere. If the department had a tracker, they would follow that static right to this specific district, right to this specific 9th-floor building. If a hound kicked that door in right now, I had absolutely nothing to defend myself with. No magic, no fangs, no superhuman speed. I was a sitting duck in an oversized band shirt. Driven by pure, undiluted survival instinct, I turned away from the window. I needed a weapon. I went to the tiny kitchen first, pulling open the drawers. I found spoons, forks, and a dull knife with a cracked plastic handle. I picked up the knife and tested the edge against my thumb. It couldn't even break my fragile human skin without serious pressure. It wouldn't do a damn thing against a department shield or an experienced mage. I tossed it back into the drawer with a loud clatter. I looked around the room. A heavy iron frying pan, a glass vase, but none of it was enough. None of it would bridge the gap between human weakness and magical force. I walked back into Asti's room, standing in the center of her desperate little shrine to the cosmos. The posters of nebulas and galaxies stared down at me, and the professional telescope stood by the window like a silent sentinel. I started to systematically search the room. I wasn't looking for her teenage secrets, her diary, or her pathetic digital dramas. I was looking for something sharp, something heavy, something lethal, a pair of metal scissors, maybe. I sat down in her rolling desk chair and pulled open the top drawer. I pushed aside the mundane artifacts of an ordinary life, spiral notebooks filled with frantic handwriting, dried out blue pens, a crumpled geometry test, a tangled mess of white earphones. Nothing useful. I opened the middle drawer, going through old makeup, half-empty bottles of cheap perfume, and a hairbrush tangled with blonde strands. Still nothing. Finally, I pulled open the bottom drawer. It was heavy, sticking slightly out of its metal tracks. It was filled with thick, rolled-up star maps and printed astronomical charts. I shoved the papers aside. My hands dug towards the very back of the wooden drawer until my fingers brushed against something smooth. It was cold and distinctly out of place among the cheap plastic and paper. I paused, holding my breath, and pulled it out. It was a small, heavy glass jar with a gold-colored metal lid, closed on it tight. I held it up to the weak light, filtering through the blinds. Inside rested a tiny, jagged, yellowish rock. A star. The exact same star I had pulled from the sky and thrown at her face months ago. She had kept it. When the magic faded and her life went back to normal, she sealed the miracle in glass and buried it at the bottom of her desk. I stared at it. My heart rate picked up and hammered against my bruised ribs. Gripping the glass jar, I twisted the metal lid. It was stuck with time and pressure. I gritted my teeth, my weak human muscles strained until, with a sharp squeak, the lid popped loose. I set the metal cap on the desk and hesitated, looking down at my blunt, pale fingers. Then I reached into the jar and pinched a tiny yellowish star between my thumb and index finger. Instantly, I felt it. A small tingle. It wasn't the roaring oceanic furnace of my past power. It wasn't the blazing inferno that could turn a city to ash, but it was undeniably real. A tiny sharp static shock traveled up my arm, tasting like heavy ozone in the back of my throat. The hair on the back of my neck stood straight up. A phantom ache flared in my gums, right where my fangs used to be. My breath stuck in my chest. It wasn't just a metaphor. It wasn't just a memory of the night I played God and lectured a human about looking at the ground. Because I created it with my own magic before I was entirely stripped of my power, the star was a physical anchor. It was a tiny battery containing a fraction of my ancient red magic. A single drop of water in a dried well. I closed my fist around it, the jagged edges pressed into my palm. It felt warm. It felt alive. I didn't consume it. I didn't crush it. I instinctively knew it was a one-time use, a single, solitary bullet. If I used it now just to heal my ribs or feel the rush of power, it would be gone forever. I had to save it. I had to keep it for exactly the right moment. But just holding it changed everything. The crushing, pathetic helplessness that had suffocated me for 4 days faded. The room didn't feel like a cage anymore. It felt like a waiting room. My spine straightened. I rolled my shoulders back, ignoring the sharp pain in my ribs. I was still trapped in a broken, biological human body, but I was no longer entirely empty. I was armed. I picked up the empty glass jar, screwed the metal lid back on, and slid it deep into the back of the bottom drawer, burying it perfectly under the thick star maps where Asti had hidden it. I kept the star, slipping it deep into the pocket of my oversized gray sweatpants. I let my fingers rest against the fabric, feeling the hard, jagged shape of it against my thigh. I stood up from the desk and walked back, over to the squeaky spring mattress, sitting on the edge of the bed. I watched the gray afternoon light slowly fade through the window blinds, listening to the rain hit the glass as I waited for Estrella to come home. I rolled the tiny star between my fingers inside my pocket, over and over again. For the first time since I woke up with mud in my mouth, the fear went away. The first real spark of ugly, calculating self finally returned to my mind. I was the Red Queen, and I was going to get my throne back.